Activision launches the third-party publisher business. EA bets big on Sega. And Microsoft nabs Halo. These stories and many more on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man.
What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. I'm your host, Carl, together here like every month with my co-host, Peter. Say hi, Peter.
Hi.
Excellent. So, yes, we're back. Slightly delayed this month due to a variety of things. Enter banter mode or something.
Amongst my vacation.
Yes. Going on vacation during the pandemic. Smart move.
Dude, we were in Austria. We were basically in the middle of nowhere. We were walking on the mountains. We were walking through canyons. And there were barely any people, so...
There was only the sound of music.
And
okay.
But still, it was it was really good, and it was a really needed vacation, dude. I was on vacation for the entire year, and yes, it's like crying on the highest possible level.
This is true.
Oh yeah, but still, it's it was good to have a 2 weeks vacation. Yeah.
Gotcha. So, for all of our listeners, that's why it's now the 4th of August, and we're recording the July episode. But don't worry, we'll get August done in August. I'm pretty sure we can pull that off.
Our longtime listeners surely remember the good old times when we started the podcast and when we never recorded the episode of the month. But we never had a delay of more than 2 months. So yeah. There
you go. That's our seal of quality. That's the beauty of doing histories of podcasts. It's all old anyway. So, okay. I guess we can go straight into the standard disclaimer. This month, we will look back at the biggest stories in and around the video game industry in July of 1980, 1990, and 2000. As always, we'll mostly be using magazine cover dates, and those are, of course, always a bit behind the actual events, but it gives us a system. So, if you have any comments, you can send those to us on Twitter at VideoGameNewsR2, or Instagram, links down in the notes, or send us an email at the extremely convenient videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. So, a quick correction before we get started. Our good friend Ethan, who also does our sound effects, he did correct me on one little bit. This was from the April episode. And this was something that actually went back and forth with between me and him for a couple of weeks because I reported, and this came out of an old magazine of the time, a Kilobaud magazine, that VCS the Atari VCS had its price drop down to $80. And I just came across a ad in a July 1980 publication, where it was actually 180. So it was probably just a typo in Kilobaud. It was 180, not 80. Still considerably less than the Intellivision, but not as big a difference as I thought it was and talked about on the show in April. So that's our big correction for the month. Anything else before we turn on the time machine, Peter?
Dude, you sound like a commentator of a darts game. Just the way you talk, but I guess this is about your girls being asleep.
Yes, this is about our girls being asleep, so I'm trying to be a very considerate husband and father and not make too much noise this evening. So no matter how many horrible things we talk about, I won't get too irate, I promise. One thing I should say is remember we do also have a Patreon, so if you want to jump over there, we do release the interview episodes early over there. So right now we have an amazing interview with Chris Garsky. This guy, basically his resume of companies he worked at is a who's of the games industry, big marketing guy at a lot of these companies. And his stories are amazing, how he sort of falls into a gig at EA in its very early days and then bounces around the industry, everybody from Sierra to Sega. He did it all. And it's a really cool interview with this guy who is a hardcore gamer himself, even to this day. And he's living the life we all wish we could lead, waking up in the morning on Hawaii. He goes body surfing in the ocean, and then he plays 6 hours of Red Dead Redemption 2. So, God, I'm envious. Okay. With that being said, let's jump in, turn on the time machine and go back to July of 1980.
Personal computers that can swallow a book. 1980. Games people play.
Welcome to July of 1980. Peter, what's our first story?
Our first story. Summer CES sees attendance drop.
Nearly 10% less visitors show up to the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. The weak economy has clearly had an impact on buyers, with many exhibitors remarking that few orders were filled. Ray Kassar, the head of Atari, gave a big speech about the future of the home computer and games for adults. But how will that work given the economic realities?
Man, good question.
Excellent.
I'm trying to remember, when did the economy recover?
You don't really get a recovery until like 82. I mean, it's not a terribly long recession, but it starts to recover about halfway through the Reagan's first term.
Mm-hmm. So it's basically safe to assume that the summer CEF of 1981 also didn't set any records of.
Yes and no. I honestly haven't gotten that far in the research, so I don't know what the next one is like. But the summer CES is usually the one where you're placing orders for Christmas.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it's weak is a sign that the retailers, aka the buyers, are simply not all that interested, or they're being very, very cautious with what they're going to buy. A lot of this can also just be chalked up to the big department stores, instead of sending a team of 20 people, are sending a team of 10 people to this thing to try to save money. That's also an option. And ultimately, this is not going to be a terrible Christmas for gaming, but it is just showing that the question of where do I put my dollars, what do I buy, is going to become a little bit tighter, and you're going to see a lot of companies that had jumped into the market, especially with the Pong consoles and stuff, that a few of them are still sort of hovering in the background at this point, but they're pretty much dead. All of those companies are going to fall by the wayside. A handful of them are going to try to make the jump. We saw that with the Imagination machine that we talked about last year, that system was basically came from a company that had made a Pong console. And then they tried to do the full-blown thing, and it was an interesting device, but just the market wasn't going to support it. So we're really seeing a shakeout. And the fact that Ray Kassar here is talking about the move to home computers, which was a widespread belief at the time, that the home computer was going to replace the game console, that the game console was just a springboard to the home computer. And the idea of games for adults trying to target that older audience makes sense given the economic realities, because the kids may no longer have the money, but the adults will at least have more money for these much more expensive devices.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's not a terrible idea on his part.
I mean, he wasn't too wrong, was he?
He wasn't too wrong, but I think he may have also overestimated just how far along the market was and how far along the technology was. Let's face it, the widespread adoption by adults of computers in the home isn't really going to happen until the internet hits big.
And that, right.
So, good idea, a little ahead of its time.
You said that the winter of 1980 wasn't too bad regarding to the sales of games, but the CES isn't only about games, isn't it? It's also about TVs and whatnot.
Exactly.
Some numbers on those more expensive devices. I mean, when the economy is bad, I don't want to go out, so I buy a game. So this keeps me busy at home, right? I can play it more than once.
Well, exactly. And we talked about that in last month's episode with that weird Space Invaders ad that Atari was making.
Yeah.
That started with, the father of the family saying, well, out here, and it's clearly one little house out in the suburbs or something, where he's like, out here, we got to entertain ourselves, so that's why Atari is awesome. That is also going to be an issue. Now, we'd have to look at the numbers for sales of things like television sets, but also remember, this is a period of time. The color TV has pretty much become a standard at this point. It had the 1970s to become standardized, and without a major revolution in technology, there's a certain limit on the size of the TV screen.
Yeah.
So while there are some innovations with different technologies for getting the color on the screen and stuff, you're going to kind of hit a wall. What's going to make a difference is the VCR, or the video cassette recorder.
Yeah. And
that's a parallel battle of technologies that's going on, but that's kind of already beyond the scope of, if we started covering that, oh my God, we'd go crazy. We'll probably run into it because there will be attempts to use it as a gaming platform as well, but that's still a little ways away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that will come. That will be, that's a story for itself, but we got a few more years before we hit that.
Right.
Okay.
More topics.
But, yeah,
okay.
It's a never-ending story here. Job security, if we were getting paid. Okay.
And our story will end in 30 years. However, Coleco sales reach $136 million.
Coleco is riding high on the sale of its electronic games as 1978's loss of $22 million turns into a profit of $9 million. Electronic games are getting cheaper to build, increasing margins and profits. So, Coleco is not yet making the move to the console. When we're talking electronic games, we're really talking these handheld electronic games or tiny little tabletop games that they're producing. But it is them making a crap ton of money.
Well, would you consider a $9 million profit a crap ton of money?
Well, you have to consider it, number one, in the time. So here you'd have to multiply it by 4. And you're talking about a toy company that is not one of the major players. I mean, we're not talking Kenner, we're not talking Mattel, we're not talking Hasbro. We're talking Coleco. Coleco before this, I mean, originally it's the Connecticut Leather Company. And their big thing was selling like Slip and Slide and, or I think Slip and Slide may have been theirs, it may have been somebody else's, but basically these large rubber products for summertime, like inflatable pools and stuff. Also about to have Cabbage Patch dolls. That's going to be another phenomenon that's going to set them completely apart. It's going to dwarf anything they do in the gaming area, but that's still on the horizon. This is a massive turnaround for this company. And just when you consider that it's pretty much, I mean, it's not exclusively coming from this one category, but it's pretty much coming from this one category. And it's a category that just a couple years earlier didn't even exist. So it's a sizable profit if you want to look at it that way.
Okay. Well, and a profit margin of 6%. Yeah.
I mean, it's the toy business.
Yeah.
Profit margins are never all that high, and also it's the toy business. These guys are not always the most upfront business people, so it is also very possible that they're fudging the numbers in order to make it look better, to not pay as much in taxes. But that's another issue entirely. Always enjoy these numbers with a certain trepidation.
That's it.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. And staying in the gaming business, because that's the show, I guess. Yeah. Sorry, my transitions. I'm out of practice. It's been too long. Okay.
Yeah. Well, keeping on talking about the history of games and the gaming business. Activision launches its first 4 games.
Despite the Atari lawsuit, Activision is taking orders for its first 4 titles. The third-party developer has been born. And yeah, we talked about the lawsuit filed by Atari last month, and this month in Plaything magazine, they're reporting that Activision is taking orders from retailers for the first 4 titles that are slated to be released. And so this is the first time that you're going to be able to buy third-party software for a game console.
Mm-hmm. So, what were the first 4 titles of Activision?
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask that.
And you still didn't do any research, man. Dude, this came...
I used to know it, but before I really make myself look bad and give the wrong list, I guess I should look this up. Okay, the first 4 games were Dragster, Boxing, Fishing Derby, and Checkers.
Cool. Checkers?
Yeah, the board game. Fishing Derby was a fishing game. Boxing was a boxing game where you saw the boxers from the top. And Dragster was where you saw these 2 dragster cars, split screen, so you could have 2 players. And it was about getting the timing right to when do you hit the gas, when do you shift the gears, and to win the drag race. And the big thing with Dragster was that the graphics were huge. I mean, it's these giant car sprites. That was just impressive as hell on a graphical level. And Boxing, because you could actually move the boxers around and you had left and right punches, that was also a huge deal. I mean, technically, these were very sophisticated games. Whether or not you'd want to play them today is a whole different ballgame. But at the time, very technical achievements, and at the same time, just the whole idea that there was another company making games for the Atari was huge. Yeah. So,
do we have any numbers on those games?
How well they ended up selling, I honestly do not. And I'm sure somebody might have those numbers someplace, but I wouldn't be able to tell you what they are off the top of my head. That's unfortunately beyond me.
Okay.
Sorry. So if any of our dear listeners have those sales numbers, we'll be glad to catch up with you next and report them on our next episode.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, get other people to do the work for us. That's the plan.
Dude, you can't. Dude, you know what? I think you are a teacher.
A teacher? Yes, I am a teacher.
Okay.
I am teaching other people to do my work. That's that's how I perform. That's the way to approach this, right? And speaking of Atari.
Yes, Missile Command is targeting 50-cent play.
Atari will be shipping the first arcade game set to default 50-cent play. This is a big jump from 25-cent play, but won't really set a precedent just yet. So
Atari actually decide how much money is going to be charged for playing a game? Or is it about or is this decision to be made by the arcade cabinets?
Well, it's like this. When you in an arcade cabinet, typically on the inside of the cabinet, so there's a little door on the bottom where the change goes in and stuff. There's also a button you can press that activates a options menu for the operator. And there you can do all sorts of things, like you can set how many coins it takes to turn the machine on. Yeah. So do you want to set it to 1 coin or 2 coins or whatever? And the size of the coin is going to determine, what the value of that coin is. A lot of the machines will also have like a free play option, which just means that you don't have to put any coins in to turn it on, which a lot of arcades will do, for example, for birthday parties. So if you have a small arcade that closes its doors for a birthday party, then they might just switch all the machines over to free play so that the kids can run around and play whatever they want. Disturbingly enough, I actually did that once when I was in college. Birthday party at an arcade right before opening time, and we just had the entire arcade to ourselves. We had everything set to free play. It was great. But this is the first time where the default is 50 cents. So if you want to set it to 25, you have to go into the menu and switch it back to 25.
Huh.
And that is a huge, huge change. I mean, the real problem here, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit next month, but the issue really here is that they're stuck at that 25 cents level, and the coin mechanisms really can only practically read 1 coin at a time. 1 coin size. You'd have to completely rebuild the mechanism to read multiple different coin sizes. And so the idea here of switching from 25 cents to something else, well, 25 cents is the largest commonly available denomination for a coin in the United States. So for those not in the US, you basically have a penny, which is 1 cent, then you've got a nickel, which is 5, then you've got a dime, which is 10, then you got a quarter, which is 25 cents, and then you go straight up to dollar bills. There's no 50-cent coin or 75-cent coin or something else. So if you want to have that impulse purchase of I throw in 1 coin and get to play, you're stuck at 25 cents. And throughout the last 2 years, reading through these magazines, especially the trade magazines for arcade operators, things like Replay Magazine and Plaything Magazine, they're talking incessantly about this debate of lobbying Congress to make 50-cent coins or making dollar coins more available so that they would have that 1 coin, 1 play mechanic, but at a higher profit margin. And it just never materializes in the United States. There are 50-cent coins, there are dollar coins, but they're so rare that they're not in circulation and nobody has them. So you can't move up to that denomination.
I had a dollar coin.
I own 2 of them. But the fact is I only own 2 of them. And it's not something I would ever pay for anything at a store with.
Right.
And that's the problem. Yeah.
Okay. Talking about problems, man. Midway sues Universal over Cosmic Alien, and this is how to do a transition.
Exactly. As we mentioned a few months ago, Midway acquired the rights to Galaxian, a game that promises to be the next big hit. Midway, of course, was not happy that Universal has released Cosmic Alien, a game with many similarities to Galaxian, but still some fresh ideas as well. The lawsuit seems destined to fail, though, as Midway voluntarily dropped their motion for a preliminary injunction after reading Universal's response papers. This case isn't going anywhere. I included YouTube links to both of the games running in the show notes so you can compare the footage. They have some similarities, like it's still, you control a ship at the bottom of the screen. flying through space. You got a star field in the background, and you've got aliens in a very Space Invaders style pattern in front of you, but they also fly through the air and then fly down and attack you and so on and so forth. So in many ways, it's similar. They are similar. Cosmic Alien also adds some additional types of enemies and a few different types of behaviors that aren't present in Galaxian. And let's face it, they're both just evolutions of Space Invaders. So from that standpoint, it's hard to argue that, it's really that much of a violation. And as far as I can tell, the case doesn't go anywhere. It basically just gets dropped. We may still see a report on it being dropped officially later on, but I haven't run across anything yet in my research.
Was it just by chance that Cosmic Alien and Galaxian were released more or less at the same time?
Well, you have to also remember, at this point, you're still getting a pretty big delay between releases in Japan and releases in the West. Also remember, Japan isn't the big source of games yet. I mean, they've had one big hit, which was Space Invaders, and they've had a few other hits coming out from Sega. But it's not, it's not the Japan-centric industry that it would become a few years later. Also, I don't know when Galaxian was released in Japan, but I'm guessing it was released at least a chunk of time before this. So even if it's just released a couple months ahead of time, remember we talked about Galaxian a few months ago, how it was being shown at a trade show in Ireland, I believe. It doesn't take much to see it running, describe it to your people back at home on the phone from your hotel room, and have somebody create a similar piece of software within a few weeks. I mean, we're not talking massively complicated programming wonders and leaps and bounds here. It's basically just, they added this to Space Invaders. Can you add this to Space Invaders? And the answer is yes, and there you go.
Mm-hmm. So it was a rip-off.
Yeah, but no more than Galaxian was a rip-off of Space Invaders. Space Invaders, they just come down in waves. In Galaxian, they fly up the screen, form a wave, and then come down in different waves. So they're more mobile than they were in Space Invaders, but the essential action doesn't change that much.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's all just minor variations on a very well-established pattern. If you want to do something completely different, like Asteroids, for example, from Atari, is adding, the physics of inertia in space. It's adding the enemies, the asteroids. When you hit them, they explode into multiple pieces. It adds the fact that you're not stuck at the bottom of the screen. You can also move anywhere on the screen, and you loop around when you hit the edge of the screen. It's a very different experience. And even though it's set in space with space aliens attacking and stuff, it is a completely different concept. But yeah, these games are just basically revisions on what had already happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
Well, want to stop talking about software and move over to hardware?
That sounds like a good transition.
Okay. I'm stepping up my game, and Japan is stepping up their chip production.
Oh, dude, you're on fire. That was great. Time magazine is reporting that the Japanese are eyeing the semiconductor industry. They plan on building out their existing 23% of worldwide market share over the next 20 to 30 years to compete with the US, the same as they had already done with TVs, cars, and steel. So, the Japanese are coming, and they're making chips. And if, for longtime listeners of the show, this might seem familiar because we've talked about the Japanese dumping chips on the market, more specifically memory chips, back in 1989 and 1990, causing a glut in the market and a price collapse, and then a a dearth of product on the market. So this is basically where that gets started. So it takes them 10 years for the system to really hit mass, but it starts right here in 1980.
Well, and they overshot their goal of competing with the US in the next 20 to 30 years by 10 years, didn't they? I mean, when they're in 1990, they caused a crash because of so many chips they produced.
Yes and no. Japan never really dominates processor chips. They end up dominating and then getting replaced by the Koreans in the production of memory chips. But they never really take on the US in processor chips. And that's one of the big differences. It's the processor chips require constant redesign. Processor chips require a ton of R&D, and you don't need as many in a machine. Like, you're going to have one CPU, one GPU. You're not necessarily going to have 20 of them like you might have with memory chips. So this is where memory chips become something you can turn into a commodity much more easily than CPUs. Mm. And that's where they do overtake the US, but primarily because the prices are dropping as it becomes a commodity, and the US just doesn't see a profit margin in it anymore.
Yeah.
And of course, then the US tries some really stupid stuff like, putting tariffs or trying to create a conglomerate of companies making their own chips that we also talked about already. And none of those really pan out because the market forces are just too strong on this one.
Snap, 10 years later. So the US, of course, tried a whole lot of stupid stuff like tariffs and forming their own conglomerates of whatnot, but still the market forces were way too strong, so China rose.
Something like that, yes. Some things just keep repeating through time again and again and again. The lessons of history. So
still there, and Japan obviously is there as well, but not as important as people were afraid that they might become.
Exactly. They were overestimating it, but we're going to see that in a short while as well. Jack Tramiel is going to give us a lesson in that.
Okay. All right. Moving on. Computers are doing graphics, and some even in color.
The New York Times has an interesting overview of the state of computer graphics this month, describing the uses computers are being put to for industrial design, document storage, and even animation. The most notable bit comes from a short profile of Ed Catmull, who had just joined Lucasfilm Limited, makers of Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, which had just come out, where he is helping establish a computer graphics division. So,
how are they doing animation before computers?
By hand.
Okay.
Well, I should say a lot of animation is still drawn by hand. What you were doing here on the computer in these early days was the computer was helping you do the timing.
Yeah.
So keeping track, basically, essentially using a fancy spreadsheet to figure out the timing of the animation cells. So when do I start the walking animation? When do I end the walking animation? How many steps do I need to get from point A to point B based off the audio recording that we've already done and stuff? That's one of the aspects of using animation for it. The other one that George Lucas pioneers through Industrial Light and Magic, his special effects studio for Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, was the computer-controlled control of cameras when filming miniatures. So that famous opening scene of Star Wars with Princess Leia's ship getting followed by the Star Destroyer that flies onto the screen, that was done with a computer-controlled camera. So they use the computer to calculate at what speed do we move the camera to get this perspective effect.
Oh.
And if you were trying to do that by hand, because the models were not scale models, the Star Destroyer is supposed to be like 100 times larger than Princess Leia's ship. Well, the model of her ship wasn't 100 times smaller than the model of the other ship. So how do you film those two separate elements and get the perspective right? And when you meld them together, if you're trying to do it by hand, it's going to look like garbage. And if you look at any of the old miniature work of spaceships and stuff in older films, you can tell it's just slightly off. That shot survives to this day because the perspective calculation was done by computer, and it's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what Catmull is going to become one of the co-founders of Pixar. This computer division is what becomes Pixar, and Lucas doesn't really see a future for it, and he sells it off. And it gets purchased by Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
So, and this is 3D animation in the sense of I build a 3D model, I tell it what to do, and then I render those individual frames.
So, how are all those, and this is actually the question I was aiming at, how are those in Star Wars, the lightsabers and the blasters?
That's all done by hand. That was all animated by hand. That was just somebody painting in, or it's a little bit more complicated. If I remember the explanation for how they did it, you have a transparency, you flood the light through the transparency, and then it's just a difference that gets superimposed on the screen.
Huh.
That's why it looks so bright and shiny.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. But, I mean, superimposing laser effects that have been done since the 60s with Star Trek on TV already. And a lot of other companies had done it as well. And I believe the same year or the year before Star Wars came out, Logan's Run came out. And they did not do it. Instead, when they fired their blasters, it was a sparkler on a little wire. And if you watch the DVD of it, you can actually see the wire in certain shots shooting this sparkler across the room and then hitting a guy in the back. So the guy basically has this cord attached to his back as he's running away, and this sparkler is coming for him and then hits him in the back.
You cannot escape, man.
It's a terrible effect. Great movie, great plot, great characters, terrible special effects.
Did this work at the on the screen of the 60s?
What do you mean?
Those special effects, with the wire. Did you see the wire in the movie theaters?
Oh, definitely. I mean, they tried to hide it as best they could, and they were always hoping that if they cut fast enough, you wouldn't have time to catch it. So when you're watching the movie for the third time at home on DVD, you're more likely to see it than if you're watching it once in the movie theater, and also back then people were just more forgiving because there was no other way to do it and you had never seen it done better. Although that you had seen done better. It just looked kind of sad and pathetic. But it was also one of the last big movies filmed on a studio backlot, instead of trying to build more realistic sets or using real world locations.
Okay.
I highly recommend it. I mean, if you've never seen Logan's Run, it's a great movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you have to be very, very forgiving with the visuals. But a great plot. Oh, the story is awesome. So, okay. But enough about science fiction and computer graphics with animation.
Yeah. Back to the roots, man. Zork is coming.
InfoWorld announces that a, quote, major software house, unquote, will be bringing Zork, the game that will topple Adventure as the top dog in the gaming arena, to the market. And this is an ominous tone, because Adventure was text adventure game that really is swept through the magazines. I mean, literally every issue of every computer magazine that I have read through while doing this podcast, and I've been doing it for almost 2 years at this point, has mentioned adventure at some point. It's either listed as an ad you can buy or whatever, and Zork is going to essentially sink that ship really, really fast. It's a whole different caliber of text adventure. It's still a text adventure. There's no images, no nothing, but the depth, the design, everything about it is going to be miles and miles ahead of where Scott Adams' adventure is.
Okay. Were the machines of this time actually able to play that game?
Yes, but they needed a little bit of trickery.
Did. Maybe they needed the Z machine.
Yes. Zork's Z machine. So Infocom's first game, Zork, is coming to a computer near you. How did this massive adventure game that voraciously ate up mainframe resources manage to be squeezed into a home micro? Well, the virtual Z machine is to think, and thus for text adventures that would grow to dominate the market is born. Now, for those not in the know, I honestly am also a little bit limited in my technical knowledge here, but Creative Computing Magazine actually breaks this down in an ungodly amount of technical detail. And the idea here is that you would write the game as a very high-level script. So with, fairly simple commands creating the connections between a description of a room, objects in the room that can be interacted with, which items will interact with what, blah, blah, blah. Basically, this long description of the game mechanic, which then needs to somehow be converted for each individual computer system. Because remember, all of these systems are not compatible with one another. We've got the Trinity at this point, Apple II, the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and the TRS-80. None of them are compatible with one another. The Trash 80 is using a Z80 processor. The Commodore PET's using a 6502. The Apple II is also using a 6502, but everything else is different about it. They have different basics, and you have to essentially rewrite the program for each of these systems. Well, the Z machine is a way of taking this basic outline for the program, and without having to reprogram it, you have different versions of the Z machine for each computer. So as long as you translate the Z machine for the new computer, you take this basic text file and it will turn it into an executable file for that new machine. And this process is a very heavy on your disk drive, so it's constantly accessing new information. This is how they can fit it into a home micro, because they're not actually fitting the game into memory the way they had to on the mainframe. They're just constantly loading stuff off the disk. And there's an upcoming interview with one of the Infocom veterans. He was a marketing guy there. That should be up here in the next couple of weeks if I get time to edit it. Absolutely phenomenal interview. And one of the things that he talks about is when Atari 400 and 800 owners would call them because their disk drives stopped working. And they would just tell them, oh no, you have to put it in the fridge for a while, in the freezer for a while, then bring it out, and then you can keep playing, because it was accessing the disk so often to get new information to fill up the RAM that it would just basically freeze. The disk drive would stop working because it was overheating. Yeah, but what this also meant was that Infocom will be able to port their games to an almost limitless number of systems, because unlike most other games, they don't have to translate the graphics, because it's just text. So, and this is going to become a major problem for any ports of games on different systems, because the graphics and the way graphic chips work on these early systems are so wildly different that the graphics used on one system will probably not be usable on the next system. You're going to have to redraw everything from scratch, which massively raises your costs and really, really changes the financial realities of game publishing. And Infocom is just going to stick with text adventures for probably too long. But while they're doing it, their games are going to get ported to every system under the sun. Yeah.
Cool.
Fun stuff.
Mm-hmm. Talking about fun stuff, playing D&D on a computer is super easy.
Just write your own DM software, and that's Dungeon Master for those not in the know. Easy, right? Creative Computing Magazine has a lengthy article that talks about how to either create a computer-controlled Dungeon Master or human Dungeon Master assistant tools on your home microcomputer. Of course, a decade later, we would get official Dungeon Master assistant software from SSI, and a decade after that, the ultimate party-based online D&D solution, BioWare's Neverwinter Nights. Previewed in 2000, but released in 2002. Took them a little while. So, yeah. And this is really a sign of how popular D&D is getting at this time. It's still not the mainstream, everybody's heard of it thing that it would be just a couple years later, but it's getting huge, especially amongst the people who would also be interested in computers. And so the fact that Creative Computing really has a long, lengthy article about how to create or approach creating a Dungeon Master Assistant program is pretty impressive.
Okay.
Yeah. You're thinking, why would you do this?
Yeah, exactly. He said just write it down.
Well, you write it down, but what you would do with this software is, for example, have all of the player character statistics on the computer. Have all of the locations for the game on the computer. Have all of the enemies' statistics on the computer so that you can keep a log of what happened. Then you can write notes of what you did so that if you ever want to pull it up, you don't have to have a big binder of what has happened in the campaign. You're just going through files on the computer. Wow. And also you can use it for random number generation and as a virtual die.
Sure.
Yeah. Which I mean, I've done. When I was in college and I was DMing, I had an assistant program on my laptop, and that was also my Dungeon Master screen. So I had all my stats, everything ready to go on the computer, and I could just Alt-Tab between windows, check the map, check what was going on. I even had an extra monitor as a side screen where I would show the players how much of the map, where they were on the map, how much they'd already uncovered, and every time I wanted to change something, I just drag it back over in Photoshop, take away part of the cover layer, and then flow it back, and they could see what was going on. It was a great way to approach it. I mean, it really just made everything run smoother. Yeah. Saved a lot of time on map drawing. That's for damn sure. So, yeah. So D&D is on the up and up. It's coming. And the troubles that it will face are also about to start. But more about that next month. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Hint at the future. See, I can do this when we're this late because I'm already deep into the research for next month. Okay. Okay. I think that's it for 1980. Let's turn on the time machine and go to July of 1990.
Today we have a ton of tips for some of the hottest titles around.
Mario Brothers 3.
You can't do that on an 8-bit system.
Welcome to July of 1990. Let's start out in the arcades. What's our first story, Peter?
Playmeter features Play Choice.
Arcade game trade publication Playmeter has a feature on Nintendo's Play Choice arcade platform. The system, which used NES titles set to a timer for play, became quite ubiquitous in the late 80s and early 90s, especially in non-arcade settings like supermarkets and pizza parlors.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm guessing you've never seen a Play Choice machine.
No, of course I haven't.
Okay. Well, they're commonly also known as Play Choice 10. We got a link to the Wikipedia page down at the bottom. And they're basically arcade cabinets with two joysticks and two button controllers, but it also featured extra buttons to choose the game that you wanted to play. So you were basically buying time to play a variety of essentially NES cards. Some of them had minor changes to them just so that they would work with the timer mechanism, but essentially you were just playing the games that were also available in the home. Now, can you guess why Nintendo might want to do this?
If they want to be like, hey, this is a demo of what you can buy.
Basically, that's it, yeah. And it was called Play Choice 10 because you could have up to 10 games in the system.
Okay.
So there was a massive variety of games to choose from, which was pretty cool. I mean, if you're in a pizza parlor and there's only one arcade cabinet and the game is a game you don't like, well, you're not going to put any money in it. But if there's 10 games in the cabinet, you're pretty much always going to find something that you want to play.
Okay.
And
so the cabinet owner decides what 10 games are in one of those cabinets.
basically, yeah. It's usually the cabinet owner, which is not going to be the location, but some operator who puts it there and then splits the take with the location.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it came in two basic varieties. I saw both of them at different times, so there's a few other variations. The first one was you had the screen, you had the controls, and above the screen you actually saw the cartridges. So you could read the name of the game off the cartridge.
Oh, okay.
And then there was another version, which was a dual screen setup, where the list of games and some instructions for the game or how to play the game would be on a second monitor above the playfield monitor. So both variations I've seen on site. And if you just Google Play Choice, you'll see a bunch of variations. There's also a variation that's just one monitor. I never personally saw one of those, but I know they're also out there. So there's the Play Choice system survived for quite a while because it was a way for everybody to test it, and everybody else would copy this. There'd also be a Genesis version of this. And I believe there's also a Super Nintendo version of it, but I don't think I ever saw one of those in the wild. The one that was most popular was the NES. Okay.
So did people actually play on those things?
Oh yeah, I mean I played on it several times. Remember, it's that whole idea of you've got a quarter in your pocket, you got nothing else to do, might as well get a few minutes of fun. And at the same time, you're looking at it, and if there's a game that you may have heard about in a magazine or something, and these cartridge games are still costing you $50-$60.
Yeah.
Maybe 30 at the time, but still, they're expensive games, especially when you can add in inflation.
Yeah.
They're expensive games, so the idea of being able to test the game out, to actually play it, is not too bad. And if you went into a store, they might have a demo unit with a handful of games on it, but they may also only have a demo unit with one game in it. So any chance to play the games before you buy it is always good. And if you actually enjoy it, well, what's going to stop you from walking out of the arcade or the pizza place and walking into a store and picking up a copy of the game? Nothing.
A lack of money?
Well, that too. And this is one of the things that the magazine is talking about. They're like, is this actually just a way to undercut the arcade? To use the arcade as an advertising tool and actually at the end of the day hurt the arcade owner or the arcade operator.
Sure.
And Nintendo is vehement of that. No, we are dedicated to the arcade, and this is a way to keep our presence in the arcade and blah blah blah. But it's clearly just an advertising tool. But at the same time, it's an advertising tool that provides the arcade operator with some very, very cheap software, and there's something to be said for that too.
Mm-hmm. So although the cake was poisoned, it was just too sweet.
That is an excellent way of putting it that I had never thought of before, but I'm totally stealing that the next time I need it.
Go for it, man. It's yours.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Okay, but enough about play choice. What else we got?
Yeah. NEC signs ICOM to develop for TG16 CD. Oh, dude. Can it be more cryptic?
No. That may or may not have been on purpose when I wrote that. So, after buying a stake in Cinemaware to help provide content for the TurboGrafx 16 CD-ROM add-on, as we talked about in a previous episode, NEC has now inked a deal with ICOM Simulations, makers of the Deja Vu series of adventure games, to bring their Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective and Camp California games to the TG16. ICOM would also release a variety of other titles, both on HuCard and CD for the system, before being acquired by Viacom in 1993. So, ever hear of Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective?
I just like the fact that there is the word consulting in the title.
Well, that was his title in the books. He was the consulting detective. You've never read a Sherlock Holmes novel?
I did.
Yeah, I'd say that
was
too.
in German. Sorry, it was just in German.
Okay, I can't remember what they called it in German. It was like the Beratender Detektiv or something like that. But he's a consulting detective because he wasn't a detective for the police. He was the one that you consulted. You came to him with a problem and you consulted. And the idea here with the game was that it was one of these early FMV games where you click through a bunch of menus, traveled around the city, picked up clues, and there would be little snippets of video of Sherlock Holmes, an actor talking to witnesses and all that stuff. And these games were quite popular, especially as bundled in games when people bought CD-ROM drives in the early and mid-90s. And so the fact that this was being ported to the TurboGrafx 16 was a smart move because this was one of the few games that existed at the time that truly took advantage of the CD medium. Yeah, so ICOM becomes one of the few US supporters of the platform. It really doesn't go anywhere, but it does mean that these games do get some console releases. And you're desperately trying to figure out how to transition to the next one, right?
Yeah, how to get away from that. Maybe by talking about EA, which goes 16-bit on Genesis.
That's right. EA has signed a deal with Sega to not only develop titles for the Genesis in North America, but to also allow Sega to release 20 of their games in Japan and market 2 of their titles worldwide. This deal will be the start of a defining relationship that would make Sega's machine the go-to platform for sports games in the coming years and would help establish Sega in the North American market.
EA Sports, mumble.
It's in the game. Yeah. Well, and this is extremely important to understand because Trip Hawkins, the founder of EA, was vehemently opposed to consoles. He did not like developing for consoles. He didn't like the idea of paying. Well, because EA is formed right around the time of the first console crash, when the 2600, the ColecoVision, and the Intellivision all basically disintegrate. And He also did not like the idea of having to pay a lot for the cartridge production, which he didn't have to do because he was a disc-based publisher.
Yeah.
And he also didn't see consoles as having a future. He was another guy coming. He used to be a salesman for Apple. He was an Apple diehard. This is why the first EA product was actually Apple II centric. Okay. And very, very quickly it turned out that by this point the Apple II was going nowhere and the Commodore 64 becomes their lead platform. But he believed in computers being the future. He didn't think consoles were it. And the Genesis is really the first time EA embraces console. A handful of their games got released for the NES, but always through third parties. And we will see that EA does release a handful of games for the NES, but they really make their claim on the Genesis. And it comes out of this whole story of they reverse engineered the Genesis cartridge because Sega hadn't really thought through how to protect the system the way Nintendo had. So you could reverse engineer it and avoid paying Sega the royalty fee. Exactly. And unlike Nintendo, which had a lockout chip. And instead of doing that, they worked out a sweetheart deal with Sega. And this also, if you've listened to the Michael Katz interview that I did, he talks about this because he was actually in charge of Sega at this time. And he gives his recollections of the events of how basically EA had them over a barrel, and he, however, worked out a deal that EA gave them a stunted version of Madden that they then released as Joe Montana Football because they had promised a football game. Sega had promised a football game for the launch, and the developer completely bungled it, and they weren't going to have the game. They had paid a ton for the Joe Montana, very famous quarterback, license, and EA saves their bacon by giving them a stunted version of Madden, and then in the next year, Madden comes out on the system, and it makes a ton of money. And so basically, yeah, this is that relationship. And EA Sports is born on the Genesis, for better or for worse. There may have been an EA Sports title on computer before that, but the reality is it finds its home on the Genesis because the Genesis is running on a much better CPU and has much better graphic hardware for moving a ton of sprites around than the Super Nintendo. Super Nintendo always struggles with sports games.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They did for quite a while, though, didn't they?
What do you mean, struggle or?
Struggling with sports games, yeah, not only during the NES era, but also later.
Well, yes, because after the Super Nintendo, they go to the N64, which really just doesn't have the muscle to move a lot of stuff around. Madden does get ported to the N64, and there are, I believe, some basketball games and other stuff on there, but it just feels primitive in comparison with what the PlayStation's doing at that point.
Yeah.
And after that, they go to the GameCube, which I don't know if EA supported the GameCube or not. I'd have to look that up. I don't have it off the top of my head. I know EA had they did support it with certain titles, like the Two Towers appears on there, but I don't know if they did the yearly sports releases on the GameCube. Probably, but I can't say it with any certainty off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't seen as the hardcore gamer system. It wasn't seen as the machismo system. So the people who were hardcore Madden fans were going to buy a PS2 or a PS3 or an Xbox 360.
Sure.
Yeah.
GameCube somehow has a kid's feeling to me.
Well, just look at it. It's got a handle so you can carry it to your friend's house. It has tiny little discs. They're tiny. They make you feel tiny. And that controller is an utter piece of crap.
It's nice and colorful and whatever. There is a 2002 FIFA World Cup on the GameCube.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
All-Star Baseball, FIFA 2006.
Mm-hmm.
is on it. No, they're not good. Oh, Harry Potter Quidditch World Cup is also on it. And Madden 2007. So there were actually quite a lot of sports games now that I'm looking through it.
Well, then they probably release ports of all the standard games for it, which makes sense. I mean, there's no reason to leave them out. It's just wasn't going to be the lead platform for that stuff.
Right, but if my kid wants to play Mario and all I want to play is Madden 2007, maybe
then you may want to do that and try to find a third-party controller that's not going to break your hands.
Exactly. Oh well, from all those sports games, only the Quidditch World Cup is the one to go to. Anyhow.
Okay, yeah, I don't really know what to say to that, but I'll leave it right.
Let me throw in some banter. When I was in the US, I actually attended a how do you say
a live
about
Quidditch game?
No, sadly not. But I attended a formal. I was invited by a friend of mine who. Well, was a girl. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone. But to go to a formal of the Quidditch team of this university.
Yeah, so a live Quidditch match.
Yeah, sadly, I didn't see the match. I just was there when there's a couple of weird dudes and somehow one really well-shaped dude. Yeah, he stuck out. Anyhow. There.
I don't even know what that comment means, but it kind of creeped me out. So yes, keep going.
Yeah, but they really run around with brooms between their legs. This is somehow.
As somebody who has been there and had a friend who was on a team, yes, It is one of the most bizarre experiences I have ever had.
Dude, I really would have liked to see one of those games made. Maybe at YouTube it later.
There's a ton of them on YouTube. You can watch them on YouTube.
Oh yeah, I will. I just totally forgot about it.
Don't. It's really not worth it. Don't. Just. I don't want to disparage anybody who enjoys the sport, and I'm sure that it's a lot of fun when you're playing it. But the game didn't make any sense in the damn books. It didn't make any sense in the damn movies, and it sure as heck didn't make any sense on a college campus. But that's just me. I enjoy my cosplay without the pretense of rules. It's just, yeah.
Man, my girlfriend is at a barbecue right now. I just picture myself after we're done recording, watching one of those Quidditch games, and she comes home and is like, "What are you doing?" Watching a Quidditch game, whatever. Almost as good as watching a Marvel World Cup, which is actually pretty good. Go Ducks!
Oh, Marvel World Cup, I can totally watch that. Yeah, that's skill.
All right.
Okay, Quidditch is probably skill too. What am I saying? But it still sticks between your legs. I cannot take it seriously. That's just my preconceived notions.
Marvel World. It has nothing to do with skill because it's not people playing against each other. It's like the teams are consisting of marbles, you know.
Oh, that's what you're talking about. That nonsense.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was actually people playing marbles. Like the marbles next to each other and stuff.
No. It's like.
Oh, okay. I know what you're talking about. Yeah. No, I don't get that. Okay, but enough about things that I'm too old to get.
Right. And talk about the serious stuff.
Exactly.
Mario goes for colors.
Exactly. With Nintendo Mania still raging, Valiant Comics has secured a license to do a series of Nintendo-themed comic books featuring a variety of the company's characters, including Mario, Luigi, Kid Icarus, Link, and even Captain N. The series would last for about a year.
And it was not super successful, was it?
Oh, it was absolutely terrible. There's a few of them online. I posted a link to archive.org where a bunch of the issues are scanned in, and clearly the people who are writing and drawing this had never actually played a video game before in their lives, and it makes no sense. It's just bad. From beginning to end. Not to say that, things like the Mario cartoon show or Captain N were good, but this is so bad, so unbelievably bad. But it does show that there was a market for this stuff.
Well, there's a market for everything, is there?
Well, yeah, nowadays through the internet, but back then you actually had to find this stuff. It was more difficult.
Who bought it? Grandmothers for soon-to-be disappointed grandchildren?
Yeah, I mean, back then comic books were found in every supermarket. There would be a spinner rack. So you could go into, when you're at the supermarket, and little Johnny wants a comic book, and for 75 cents or whatever, you could pick up a copy of Mario and then just throw it into the shopping cart and take it home. And then he reads it on the way home and starts wondering why he's wasting his life, you know? Something like that.
Philosophical questions.
Wonderfully philosophical questions. But, okay, let's keep going. We've got big fish yet to fry.
Nintendo sues Galoob over the Game Genie.
As we expected, Nintendo has threatened legal action against Galoob over the Game Genie. The device that allows players to add cheat codes to NES games is being accused by Nintendo of creating, quote, derivative works, end quote, and thus a violation of copyright law. Galoob has initiated an action for injunctive relief and a declaratory judgment from the court, while Nintendo filed a copyright infringement suit. In July, Nintendo would be granted a temporary injunction pending the resolution of the case, but have to pony up $15 million for a bond should they lose the case.
I don't get that.
The bond issue? Basically, okay, so a temporary injunction is a court order that says that a person or a company has to stop performing a certain action while the case is pending. So until a case gets resolved, if there's a temporary injunction, you can't keep doing what you're accused of doing.
Mm-hmm. So Galoob had to stop, selling the Game Genie.
They had to stop selling the Game Genie pending the resolution of the case.
Okay.
But the judge said there's still a high enough chance of Galoob winning that in case Galoob does win, there's this $15 million bond waiting there. So in case Galoob wins, they automatically get the $15 million.
Why?
As compensation for the lost sales during the injunctive period.
Okay.
Okay. So the idea is the judge is basically saying, you know what? Nintendo might actually win this. So I'm gonna just say, if I can't let you keep selling it while we're trying to figure this out, because if you keep selling it, you're going to be damaging Nintendo. But at the same time, if Nintendo loses and you weren't allowed to sell going into the holiday season, that's a massive loss for you. So, you know what, Nintendo, pony up this $15 million. The court is going to hold on to it as a bond, or it's going to be put into an escrow account. And if you lose, that money goes straight to Galoob. So Galoob doesn't have to sue you for damages later on. They're just going to get this $15 million.
Mm-hmm. And why did the judge not simply decide about the case?
Well, because he has to hear evidence, and the witnesses have to be prepared, and you have
it was
trial.
Before the trial.
This is all before the trial, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and this is where we get into the injunctive relief is basically something you do ahead of time. Well, in this case, it's being done ahead of time. So, yeah. And Galoob is going to end up winning this case. But the damages that they suffer from the loss of sales far, far exceeds the $15 million. It was just a drop in the bucket of what they could have made.
Okay.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, Nintendo holds them off for a little bit. They're going to end up releasing versions of the Game Genie for all the other consoles of the time. And, of course, they're going to continue to sell the Game Genie in Canada, where Nintendo isn't able to stop them from selling it. And a lot of great imported Game Genies will make it from Canada into the United States.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I remember from back when I was a kid that there were actually Game Genie codes for Nintendo games. So
Yeah.
sure, they didn't die right away.
Oh no, they kept going for quite a while, and there was later on the Game Shark for the PlayStation.
Oh yeah, I
and,
heard about that as well.
yeah,
Sure.
and I mean nowadays I don't know if there's any equivalent on the modern games, but let's face it, most modern games are easy enough that it's not a big deal, or there's built-in cheat codes someplace. So
Right.
on consoles, it's not a big deal, and on PC, well, we've been hacking and cheating in games since day one. So it doesn't really matter. I mean,
Well,
anybody
the
who
files
had
are
a
out there out in the open.
well, I mean, anybody who had a soft reset button on a Commodore 64, the whole purpose of that was to do a soft reset. The game data was still in memory. You add a poke or a peek, and then jump back into the game, and now you had infinite lives or something. So yeah, that's the oldest trick in the book.
Okay. Okay. From old to young, 9-year-old sues Nintendo and LJN and Major League Baseball.
In one of the most bizarre incidents of video game products liability history, 9-year-old Clark Thiemann, or Thiemann, not quite sure, sued the three companies over LJN's Major League Baseball. And I just add this because it got mentioned at this point, and the Gaming Historian, absolutely amazing channel. I highly recommend everybody follow him. He did a bit on this. He did a retrospective on this case a while back. Link is in the description below. The case doesn't go anywhere. Gets dismissed early but after Nintendo files a motion with the court. But the core idea here was that the game had a management mode, but because they had not secured the license to use player names from the Players Association, they could only use the team names because they had the league license, and they had the stats and the numbers of the players, but they couldn't put the names of the players. So it made it very difficult. Plus, the kid bought the game a year or two after the game had originally come out, so the rosters were out of date. And the idea here was that this should have been better labeled, that, you know, that the names aren't in there, that the rosters are from a specific year, and so on and so forth, and that this game wasn't the experience that was being promised. And you can sort of understand the kid's annoyance, but at the same time, you can also understand that there's limitations to what you can do on cartridge software, especially back then. There's no way it was going to be updated. And it sort of shows the disconnect at the time in the industry between people's understanding of what software could be in that format and what it actually was, which is kind of why this story resonated with me a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's false advertising. We look at it today as sophisticated consumers who understand games, but back then, I mean, the 2600 market had collapsed. The NES market was huge, but it was really for most consumers their first real encounter with with console software. And so the hyperbole machine was not understood as a hyperbole machine. It was often just understood as, oh, this is what it really is. And, well, the game also was crap, but that's another issue entirely.
And not part of the lawsuit. Anyone, how? Want to move on?
Yeah. Yes, let's move on. Let's go across the pond.
Yeah, but again, I really recommend watching this video. It's like 6 minutes, but it's really entertaining. And I like the fact that this guy, this young boy, was he working for like a summer or something? And all I got out of it was
bottles.
Huh?
Yeah. He was collecting bottles to earn the money to be able to buy this game.
Not bad. Not bad. $40. We're no longer here to collect bottles for that.
Long time.
Anyhow, Tynesoft goes bust.
Venerable UK game publisher Tynesoft, that had started out by publishing educational product back in 1983 and had recently launched games based on licenses such as Superman and Beverly Hills Cop, has folded. According to Commodore User Magazine, the company was pinning all of its hopes on Elvira, Mistress of the Dark from Horrorsoft, but that game's delay meant that a lack of product to ship was going to cause major problems. The company has now gone into receivership. Accolade would pick up the distribution rights to Elvira.
And was the Superman game any better than Superman 64?
Curious that you should mention that. The Angry Video Game Nerd, when he did his Superman 64 episode, probably one of his most famous ones, it actually starts with him saying, "Oh, everybody wants me to do Superman 64," so he reviews Superman for the Commodore 64. Now, there were two different versions of Superman for the Commodore 64, two different games released by two different publishers, and the Tynesoft one is the second one. It's an okay game. It's not bad. It's not great, but it's not bad. And Angry Video Game Nerd actually gets it right. He says it's a decent game. And he sort of does a complete review of the game with all the levels and everything, and before going into the Superman 64 review. And yes, so it is an actually functional game, unlike Superman 64. And I mean, it's not great. It's not something I would personally spend a lot of time on. I had it back in the day, played it for a little while, got annoyed and bored with it, and moved on to better things. But it did have some really nice presentation. Like, the story was told through comic book panels that you got to read between missions and stuff. So it was kind of cool. But yeah, it's nothing special. Watch the Angry Video Game Nerd video on it, and you'll see what I mean.
Yeah, I will.
I'll add the link into the show notes for that, just because now we talked about it, now I have to. So, and I'm saying that right now to remind myself while I'm editing this that I need to add it, because I'll forget it otherwise.
Good. Okay.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, moving on. Nuclear War is coming to the C64.
Well, that's what an ad for the game says in this month's Computer Gaming World. Sadly, this would not prove to be true. The game was never ported, and now that I know it was advertised, I am sad. So, I'm guessing you've never played Nuclear War?
No.
Okay, and we talked about it a few months ago because the art was done by a very famous graphic artist for the Amiga, and it was one of my favorite games back in the day. It's a tiny little game. Playing through an entire game is at most 10 minutes long. It's loosely based off of a card game, and it's you versus 4 computer-controlled players, each one represented by a politician from back in the day, with funny names and caricature faces and very different strategies. And you're essentially 5 separate continents on the world, and you're trying to be the last man standing, the last person with population after blowing the other people up, bombarding them with propaganda, and so on and so forth. And yeah, it totally would have worked as a Commodore 64 game. It didn't. It was just a couple of menus, a few funny animations. You could have made this work on a C64. So it doesn't surprise me that it was advertised as coming soon for the Commodore 64. I have actually exchanged messages with the original programmer and designer of the Amiga version, and he told me he was not aware of any plans to port this to the C64, but he also said that that was beyond his area. And I've also now contacted the people at the games that weren't, and they've started a page about this. And I have contacted the old heads of New World Computing, the company that made it, to see if they might answer. And I haven't heard back yet, but I am hopeful that I will get an answer from them before all is said and done. So hopefully in a future episode we get an update as to whether or not this was just something that they wrote in the advertising to see if there was a response, or if this was a project that was ever actually started.
So you think the possibility is that they like set up the ad just to see if there's any response? So, hey, people want this, so we should develop it.
That is definitely a possibility, especially with a game like this. I can't imagine the C64 turnaround time would have been lengthy. It was probably would have been relatively short, maybe a 2 to 3 months turnaround. It could be that that's what it was. It could also be that they actually tried to develop and then just decided, the market's not there. But New World Computing was still porting a lot of their bigger RPGs to the C64 around this time. Okay. So King's Bounty was also advertised in the same issue, and that got released on the C64. So it's a toss-up. It's possible it was made. It's possible it's not. For those who haven't visited the website before, Games That Weren't is a website that tries to track down games that were never released. So games that were maybe previewed in a magazine, or games that were advertised that never came out, or games that were completed and just never released. And sometimes they're able to track down the games, the half-completed games, or graphics resources, or talk to the developers to find out what happened. And they're a great resource. Absolutely amazing company, website. And they just released a hardcover book collecting some of their biggest cases. So I recommend everybody check that out. Link again down in the show notes.
Okay.
Yep.
So let's move on from things that weren't to things that ceased to exist. Infocom is no more.
Mediagenic has shuttered the last vestige of Infocom. So we just talked about them starting up 10 years earlier. Back in our September ep, we talked about how Mediagenic had closed down the East Coast offices of the company, and only a handful of employees were moved to the West Coast, with only one hypertext game still being worked on. Well, now the Games Machine is reporting that even that final vestige of the company is no more. The Infocom label will still appear on some titles developed by Mediagenic, which itself is in financial straits. So, yes.
So text adventures there's no market for text adventures anymore in the 1990s.
There wasn't really any by 1987. Again, I have an interview coming up that once it's edited that will reveal all about Infocom and the inner workings. But essentially what happened was that Infocom never wanted to be a game maker. The company was always positioning itself to be a general software development company. They wanted to do application software. The games just kind of came by accident, because when the college students that formed the company started the company, the program that they already had created that was ready to go was a game, Zork. Yeah. So they published that, and then the Z Machine made it easy to make more games. And they essentially, instead of developing better game technology to keep up with times in games, they instead invested the money earned from the games in attempts to compete with companies like Microsoft for database software and spreadsheet software and all this kind of stuff. And they never got it off the ground. And by the time they actually decided, okay, we need to create a new game engine, they were already so far behind the curve, and the skill sets internally apparently were so not in the right place for that kind of development. I mean, by 1990, Sierra is already a powerhouse, creating a ton of point-and-click adventure games each year. You've got LucasArts making point-and-click adventure games. You have so many graphical RPGs on the market that for them to really do that 180, they would have had to have a lot more money on hand in order to invest in that changeover, and they had already blown that cash that they should have had on the Office products.
Yeah.
And it's sad. I mean, they do a couple of weird things towards the end of the 80s, like the infocomics, which are you have graphics, and they're based off of Zork, Leather Goddesses of Phobos, and I can't remember what the third one was. And the idea is it's a non-interactive story, and you're reading it like a comic book, so you have a still image at the top and then some text. And as you go through the story, at certain points, there's going to be two characters, and then you decide which character to follow. So then you only get that other character's storyline. So that way you can read it multiple times and follow different characters at different times to get a different angle on the story.
Okay.
Yeah, just a bad
interesting take, but limited scope of what you can do.
Well, extremely limited on an 8-bit computer, extremely limited with a lack of animation, and extremely limited because the load times were atrocious.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, so...
Published book.
Exactly. And it just didn't work. I think I have two of them. I have the Zork one, and I never got the Lane Mastodon one. That was the Leather Goddesses of Phobos base one. And I got another one. I just can't remember what the title was. But it doesn't really matter. But we'll talk more about Infocom as we go through the history of it. And like I said, great interview coming up about the history of Infocom. So, okay. And we go from things that are dying to things that are just getting going.
It's the circle of life, man. Apogee offers free try-out games.
In a sign of things to come, Apogee Software is offering a 2-for-1 tryout package. If you send $3 for shipping and handling to them, you get The Lost Adventures of Croz and Word Whiz, two of their many programs. Shareware was already a thing by this point, but it hadn't reached the meteoric heights that were just around the corner yet. Promotions like this would help spread the word.
So how did they ensure that I don't only pay $3 and keep both games?
No, you're not supposed to return them. Okay, you don't know what shareware is, do you? Okay, I need to explain the concept of shareware. Okay, the idea of shareware was this. Developer releases, let's say, the first 2 levels of a 10-level game.
Yeah.
And you have a license as an owner of a copy of that to make as many copies as you want and give them to as many friends as you want. You can share those with anybody you want. You don't have a copyright to it, but but you're allowed to pass it on to others. When you're playing the game, or on the front page of the title screen of the game, there'll be an option to get instructions for how to purchase the rest of the game. So if you like these first 2 levels, send us $20 and we will send you a disc with all 10 levels on it, the full program. And this is how the shareware model worked.
No, I still don't get it. Isn't it just a demo? I mean, shareware.
It is a demo.
It's the same.
It's a demo. Now, it's a demo that you usually bought in a store, or especially back then, I remember seeing spinner racks with a ton of these Apogee discs. And it wasn't just for games. I mean, you'd have it also for things like office productivity software or little applications. And Apogee is the company that later becomes 3D Realms. I mean, they're the guys who released Doom and Wolfenstein as shareware. They released Commander Keen as shareware. They released Duke Nukem 3D as shareware, and the original Duke Nukem games, the jump and run ones. So they basically create this whole model where we're going to give you a couple of levels, have fun with it. Oh, you want more? Now you got to pay.
Yeah.
And people sent in the money, and the checks came in, and the discs went out. And what you do with this is that you're getting the full price, because as everybody who listened to our Bill Steely interview about microprose, if the publisher goes to the retailer gets to keep 50% of the sales price. If you go through a regional distributor to then get to the retailer, now you're only getting 25% of the price, because the regional guy also gets his cut. So this was a way to get 100% of the sale price. And remember, the retailer's not going to keep your product on the shelf for forever. After 6 months at most, they're going to say, this isn't moving, get rid of it. Well, the shareware's out there. There are cases even today where some of these old shareware guys had their old home addresses in the game, and occasionally people will still send in money looking for a full copy. Because, well, they're playing the demo and they see it. I mean, it's a little ludicrous nowadays, but it still happens. Yeah. So, this was the shareware model. This made a lot of this software distribution, especially over these huge distances that you had in the US, where distribution was difficult. Again, I've been doing a ton of interviews. Everybody who's listening, you have no idea. We haven't been doing the regular recordings, but I have been doing a ton of interviews. It's a great interview with Jerry Wolosenko. He was one of the earliest software distributors in the United States back in the very early 80s, and then later on became the representative for Psygnosis in North America. And he talks very eloquently about the difficulties of software distribution in the United States at the time, just based off the distance, and how that changed the number of titles that you could release, the frequency of releases, the staying power, and the necessity to make sure that the games had a certain quality, because it just took so long to get the games out to every store in the country that by the time you did it, if you had the next game coming right afterwards, you went crazy. You couldn't possibly do the distribution otherwise. And this was a way to bypass having to spend all that money for distribution.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Okay, so I think that wraps up July of 1990, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. I think so.
So let's turn on the time machine and head back to July of 2000.
As an industry, video gaming is bigger than Hollywood.
Y2 electronic launch in history.
Welcome to July of 2000. So, Peter, what's our first story?
Well, it's something that's never going to happen again. Sony announces $300 launch price.
Sony has announced that they will be releasing the PlayStation 2 at $299. This makes it $100 pricier than the Dreamcast was at its launch, but given that the machine has DVD capabilities, it's still going to be a steal, and will cost the same as the original PSX had back in 1995. So, I mean, it's a significant number. It's a famous number. You know about the famous announcement from the head of Sony at the not CES, E3 in 1995. I believe it was 1995 E3.
Wasn't it just one dude who went at the stage and just set the price and that's it?
And walked off, yeah. Well, it's because Sega announced the Sega Saturn price the day before, and their price was $399. So he just came up there and said $299 and walked off. And this started the fame. Basically, I can't believe it took this long for somebody to say, you know what, we're not going to announce until Sony announces. And this is why now at the beginning of August, we still don't know what the price of the new consoles will be at the end of this year, because Microsoft decided not to play Sony's game and just decided not to announce the price. And Sony doesn't even know how to respond if they don't get to respond to something. They don't have a fixed price ready to go. And so they can't play the price game like they did the first time around, and they did last time. Instead, this time they're basically, we will see how this generation plays out with COVID and everything else. But back here, they're going 100 higher than Dreamcast, which means that the Dreamcast was 200 lower than the price of the Saturn. It was a very, very cheap machine in that regard. But yeah, I mean, $199 was super cheap for the launch of new hardware, especially hardware that was that relatively powerful.
Right. But didn't they do this because of the PlayStation?
Well, they did it because of the PlayStation. They also did it because the Saturn had been such a failure. Yeah. And the problem is the PlayStation 2 is coming in with way too many big name titles in the pipeline. Not at launch, but in the pipeline. And the DVD capability. Yeah. It's the cheapest DVD player on the market at this point. Mm-hmm. And it's also a super powerful game system. So if you just wanted a cheap DVD player, you bought a PlayStation 2. And if you wanted a super powerful game system, you bought a PlayStation 2. And at the same time, you might also want to buy some DVDs. Or you might want to buy a game. And yeah, it pays off in massive, massive profits for someone. Right. Yeah. Oh well. But it's not all rosy for Sony.
It's not all rosy for Sony. Bleem! Exclamation point. Gets court order against Sony.
Very good, thank you. To avoid another E3 booth shutdown like in the previous year, Bleem has obtained a court order prohibiting Sony employees from coming to their booth. This is what we call subjunctive relief. Yeah.
How did they control that?
Well, they didn't control. They couldn't control it directly, but what it means is that if somebody tried to shut down the Bleem booth, the question would be, well, how do you know that you want to shut it down? Because what had happened in 1999 was that the Sony people saw the Bleem booth. They went to the E3 organizers and said, hey, these guys are, doing illegal stuff with our software. And the E3 organizers were the ones that removed it. Now, the only people that would go to the E3 organizers and complain about this would be the Sony people. And so if the E3 organizers show up, then you basically haul them in front of court and say, why did you shut this down? And they'd say, well, the Sony people asked us to. Then you bring in the Sony people and say, why did you do this? And it's like, well, we went and looked at the booth. So this is why, yeah, and the Sony employees don't want to get in trouble with it. So by having the court order, basically you're ensuring that they're not going to get fined by the court for doing this.
Cool.
Yeah.
Didn't see that yet from going to court. Awesome.
Yeah. And for everybody who doesn't remember, Bleem is the PlayStation emulator, the commercially available PlayStation emulator for PC at this point.
And Bleem is coming to the Dreamcast.
After having brought PSX emulation to the PC, Bleem is planning on doing the same for Sega's Dreamcast. The first disc will apparently run 100 PSX games with improved graphics And Bleem is even considering launching PlayStation-style controllers so that players can have access to the additional buttons on a PSX pad. At E3, this would morph into the Bleem Pod, which would allow a PSX controller to be hooked up to the Dreamcast. And none of this ever happened.
Really? Too bad.
Yeah.
Pretty cool idea, but 100 games on one disc?
Well, the games themselves aren't on the disc. So the disc would just be the emulator with settings for a specific 100 games.
Okay.
Yeah. If anybody who's ever tried to emulate PlayStation games knows it's a huge pain in the butt. Because the PlayStation hardware, while relatively straightforward, also got used a ton of different ways by software developers. They basically kept finding new ways to twist and turn and tweak the timing of the chips and stuff to get new effects. So when you're doing the emulation, you have to constantly be changing the settings of the emulator for different games to work properly, because if you try to emulate the entire system 100% accurately, the whole thing just slows down to molasses. So you basically tweak this, tweak that, just tweak the parts that you need for a specific title.
Okay, so but how can I picture this thing working? So you have this disc which has all the settings and the emulator and the settings for 100 games. This is the thing you put into your Dreamcast, right?
Yes. And then you get a menu screen pops up. You choose the game that you want to play. It loads the emulator and the settings into the Dreamcast memory. Then a message comes up saying, please remove the Bleemcast disc and insert the game disc. So you take out the Bleemcast disc, you put in your PlayStation game, and you close the lid and you hit the button, and now it loads the PlayStation game through your Dreamcast.
Okay. But this never worked.
Well, it didn't work this way. What Bleem will ultimately launch on the PlayStation are individual discs that play single games. Yeah. So I believe they released one for Metal Gear Solid. They released one for GT Gran Turismo. And that might actually be it. There might be a third one that they released. So the exact details of how that came about is something that I'm still looking into, and I'm trying to get an interview with somebody who can give us more dirt on this, or at least the actual mechanics of why this was done this way ultimately. And the other problem is also that this adapter for the PlayStation controllers never comes out. And so that also limits you, because a PlayStation controller has the 8 firing buttons, 2 on each shoulder, and then the 4 in the front. The Dreamcast only has 2 shoulder buttons and 4 buttons on the front. So any game that requires those additional buttons is suddenly hampered at best, unplayable at worst. And then you go even further. The later games are using the DualShock controller. So it has 2 analog controllers. Well, the Dreamcast only has 1 analog stick. So if you need the second analog stick, the game is unplayable on a Dreamcast controller. Yeah. So some of the older games like Gran Turismo or a Metal Gear Solid, which are released, I believe, they're still released before the DualShock comes out. They don't use the DualShock. So you can still sort of get by, but even then you're missing 2 shoulder buttons. It's a big problem.
You know which controller had those shoulder buttons?
You mean 4 shoulder buttons? Well, the Xbox?
Exactly. So, you think there's a possibility of Bleem coming to Xbox?
Nice transition. You're right. I really should leave this up to you. There's a rumor going around that Bleem might be coming to the Xbox, which would counter Sony's argument that backward compatibility with PSX games is a reason to buy the PS2. And remember, we're at the point right now where the Xbox they've shown off a tech demo. It's the famous one of the some woman in the future doing martial arts moves with these VR style gloves, and a giant robot behind her is also doing the moves. The stats for the Xbox have been released. They look amazing. But Sony is still touting, hey, PlayStation 2 is backward compatible. You get slightly better graphics on most of the games. And so if you buy a PlayStation 2, you get to also keep your PlayStation 1 catalog without losing that backward compatibility. And this really could have been a game changer because the Xbox controller had all the sticks, all the buttons, could have played all the games, and it was powerful enough to do PlayStation emulation without a problem, as anybody who has modded an Xbox knows. So, yeah, I mean, it could have been a game changer and really would have pushed this question of emulation legality or commercial legality into a whole new realm. But, yeah, it's also not going to happen, unfortunately.
You know, I just like the argument of backward compatibility to buy a new console. Most people that I know, not counting you, do not go back to the old games. At least not on their console, then you would just play it on a PC.
Well, yes and no. You also have to remember that you're looking at it from the standpoint where at least 50 to 60% of the people playing are adults. Whereas in 1990, it's at least 70, 80% kids. There's statistics about, which percentage are playing and stuff, but it's still seen as a child's toy in many, many ways. And parents were outraged when the Super Nintendo came out and wasn't backward compatible with the NES. There's a video online on YouTube. You can find it. It's a news report from back in the day when with these parents who are just like, hey, I've been buying all these games for little Jimmy, and now Nintendo wants me to buy a new system that's not compatible, that I'm going to have to buy all new games, and he's not going to be able to play the old games anymore. That just seems like a ripoff. And that console transition is not that far in the past. I mean, it hasn't been that many generations of software since. And this is the first time that we're going from CD-based console to another CD-based console. Remember, PlayStation, it starts the CD-based console, really. You had the add-ons for the Jaguar and you had the add-ons for the Sega CD and the TurboGrafx, but those were add-ons. They never really had big market penetration. This is the first time where the primary source for a mass market console, again, 3DO, we're not going to count it. CDI, we're not going to count it. CD32, we're not going to count it. But it's the first successful one that's getting a sequel. And, well, it's just a disc. So why not sell it as this is a big thing? And remember, the PlayStation is not a dead system. We're getting new Final Fantasies on it. We're getting new Spyro games on it. We're getting new Crash Bandicoot games on it at this point. There's a lot of software still coming out for the system. It's still very popular, and it's got the dual analog sticks. So it's not, this primitive backward control mechanism. It can do 3D with 3D controls.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And, it's going to be, it's just the extra added argument of, you might buy one or two new games, but, you still want to pop in your Street Fighter Alpha 3 from the PlayStation and play it, right? Well, you're going to have two systems plugged into your TV? Why bother? Got one system, does everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see it. It's just... Again, as I said, most people that I know, Don't go back to those old games.
And
now
of
that
course,
Microsoft is...
and of course, that's a true argument. But at the same time, when you're standing in the store in front of the two systems, and you can't decide which one, well, the one that still plays all the games that you still have at home might actually make the decision a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Sorry, I ruined your transition.
No, you didn't. I didn't have one for that.
Okay, perfect.
I mean, there's no possible connection between the Xbox, Microsoft, and Bungie being bought by Microsoft. So
none whatsoever. Nice.
None whatsoever.
Well done. So, Bungie, a longtime Mac development house famous for the Marathon and Myth series, has been bought by Microsoft. The game was originally showcased at the 1999 Macworld Expo and presented by Steve Jobs himself. Well, now it looks like it will be coming to the Xbox. Bungie's other in-development title, Oni, will remain a Take-Two release. So, Halo.
Yeah.
Do we even have to say anything? It's Halo.
It's Halo.
Yeah.
People like it.
Apparently. I personally never really caught on with me, but I'm not a big FPS guy, so.
Well, welcome to the club, man.
Yeah. But, I mean, this was big news when Microsoft bought it because, as we've talked about it over the last year, Apple at this time was sort of kind of trying to make a move as a gaming platform, not very successfully. Bungie's Halo was going to be, the Mac exclusive game that was going to make it really cool. And the fact that Microsoft just buys them up and doesn't even think it's not primarily to turn this game into a PC game. They're trying to turn it into a console game. It will be released for PC and Mac later on, but they're buying content, this action content that they're not developing in-house. And and it becomes the system seller, especially through the deathmatch options. So, good times.
Good times. I mean, a whole lot of stuff was invented back then. Like 20 years ago.
That's true. And just alone controls of an FPS on a pad were really, really in their infancy at the time.
Yeah. But then again, I'm not a big FPS fan, neither on PC nor on a console.
I hear you. I mean, the FPSs I really enjoyed, I can probably count on one hand.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Bioshock was pretty good.
I also did not care for it. I liked the story. I liked the setting.
Exactly.
But the gameplay got in the way. The ones that I really, really enjoyed were Duke Nukem 3D, again, mainly because of the humor and the environments. Shogo Mobile Armor Division, because I absolutely just love the anime feel of that. No One Lives Forever. That was phenomenal just because they got the first-person use of stealth right in that game. And also just, I love the humor and the dialogue and everything about the atmosphere of that game just oozes style. And I think that's pretty much it. That was the end of my first-person dalliances. Okay, on to other PC-related topics.
Other topics. The Sims gets an expansion pack.
Yes.
Is this really news?
Oh, this was huge news. So, with the meteoric rise of The Sims, EA has decided to expand the game with their Livin' Large expansion pack that will not only double the number of items in the game, but also expand the career options, introduce new NPCs, and fun stuff like crystal balls. This will no doubt be the definitive add-on to the game, and we won't get any more of these in the future.
Yeah, The Sims is insane.
Yeah, I mean, when you're reading the articles, we talked about how big The Sims was a few months ago when it was first reviewed. and this expansion pack just has so many different things in it. So many, it basically expands every element of the game. And it just felt like, okay, this is one expansion and that's it. And there's really no need for another expansion. They're trying to do everything in one expansion. And you almost get this feeling they're like, okay, we need to strike while the iron's hot, just give them more stuff to do. That'll be the end of it. The Sims will probably burn itself out in a few more months. And the fact that it didn't, and then they just kept adding more and more and more expansions. And then this became the business model for the Sims going forward. And that these expansions went from being physical products that you purchase in addition to the physical main game to DLC is kind of a harbinger of things to come in gaming. And it wasn't the first expansion pack ever. I mean, their expansion packs go way, way back. But it was the first one where just the expansion pack became the actual driving financial force. That was kind of new.
Yeah, and Sims was just insane. I mean, my sister was pretty much really into The Sims, and on Christmas when you didn't know what to buy as a gift, what sucks for the dad is the expansion pack of Sims for my sister. I mean, not anymore, but back in the day. And
yeah, no, I totally understand.
And one time it was diesel SS Wars, so it's just diesel jeans and whatnot, just diesel stuff. This is an expansion pack, so
yeah,
I don't know, man.
It's one of those things where you have players that they're not really game players, they're Sims players, just like the Madden players or the Minecraft players, that they want that one game and that's it. And as long as you keep adding more elements to it, they're perfectly happy. They don't need a different gaming experience.
Mm-hmm. And adding elements, they did.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah, it's just insane. And they're still making more and more and more for the latest version of The Sims. I mean, I played The Sims. I was addicted to it for probably about a month, where I did everything you could do in the base game. I played so many hours of it. And then I got really ticked off when you really couldn't turn it into a generational story. When your characters didn't, grow old and die, and their kids, in the meantime started to take over and stuff. I really wanted sort of that life career thing. And then when Sims 2 started to sort of get close to that, but never really did it. And what I really wanted was, I was like, okay, I want to start a family in 1900 and just move the family all the way through to the modern era with, period accurate cars and equipment and stuff, and have it slowly evolve. So you might get into the 1970s and there's still a couple old pieces of furniture in the house from the original thing 2 or 3 generations earlier, but you've remodeled everything else and stuff. And I thought that would just be this cool legacy thing of building generational, and it never evolved into that direction, and that kind of ticked me off. So I'm still waiting for that version of The Sims. But
You might want to wait, dude. I mean, due to the enormous success of The Sims 4, The Sims 5 was delayed into 2021, and oh well.
Yeah, and I mean, until The Sims 4 stops making as much money as it is, there's no reason to come up with a new game. I mean, it's,
of course not.
Yeah, disturbing. Oh well, okay, but we're not done
cool.
yet.
No, we're not. Okay, let's just move on. I
Sorry,
just
you were
wanted
going to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little quick about the cash grab of what was in Battlefront, Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2, the new versions from the last couple of years, this was a major outcry, but they are doing basically the same stuff with The Sims, not the loot boxes, but like the cash grabbing. EA is famous for that. And with the game The Sims, it's totally okay. No one talks about it.
Well, the difference is that when you buy a Sims expansion pack, you're not getting random goods. It's not a gambling effect where, I might get it, I might not get it. It doesn't mean that you're going to have an edge over the other players. So that I wouldn't compare those two experiences, because you're not influencing the ability to win, and you're not influenced because there's no win situation in The Sims, and you're not giving people only a chance. They're not buying a chance when they pay money. They're buying an actual known product. So I don't see it as a problem. I mean, if people want to expand their game, it's kind of like buying expansions to a board game like Carcassonne.
Oh, yeah, sure.
It's the same exact concept.
Yeah, sure. I still think it's ridiculous, but of course, what do you want to waste your money on? Go for it.
I mean, I think of it this way. For example, I played the Assassin's Creed 2 trilogy. So there's 3 games that are all using basically the same game engine, following the same character. So in theory, you could just play Assassin's Creed 2, be done with it, jump to Assassin's Creed 3, or you could play these other 2 games that came out as full-price titles, but that also have DLC in the form of additional missions and side stories and quests. Well, the DLC was adding something, but at the same time, why wasn't it just in the game? That's the question you could ask. And my solution to that is I just play it 10 years after it came out, and then you get the full version for pennies, and that's it. And wow, I've really become an old gamer. But what I'm trying to say is that, why wasn't this one guy's story the first game? Why wasn't that Assassin's Creed 2? Well, it's because the game would have been too freaking huge, would have taken 7 years to develop, as opposed to maybe 3 years, and the cost of development would have meant that purchasing the game would have been like a $200 purchase, as opposed to 3 $60 purchases.
Yeah, man, I mean, I get the concept of DLC, and it always depends on what you get for your money. When you see the DLC of, like, for instance, The Witcher, where the DLC really adds hours of gameplay to the game, new content, I'm more than willing to pay money for that. But Diesel Jeans, oh well. But you're totally right. If there's someone out there who enjoys the Diesel Jeans add-on, good for you.
Exactly. Hey, there's people who pay good money to have a gun wrapped in bacon in Call of Duty, so who are we to judge? You didn't know that was a thing, did you?
It actually does not surprise me. And
you can get a skin for your gun that makes the gun look like it's wrapped in bacon.
I wonder how this will play out when the I Smell is finally released.
Nice transition.
Oh, yeah.
DigiSense, a company, has announced that it will bring a new sense to computers, smell. The iSmell will be a USB device that emits odors to help immerse the user by mixing 128 different chemicals that come in a plug-in cartridge. The device will end up working, but never make it to store shelves due to the simple fact that no one wants or needs it. The prototype worked, though. So,
yeah.
And the iSmell was something I actually remember seeing this profiled in magazines and stuff back in the day. And there was all this talk about how to enhance the web. You know, we had audio files being added to websites. We had video files being added to websites. And this really was less of a thing for video games and more a thing for the web.
Dude, just think of all the dirty stuff that the thing could be used for.
Oh, dude, this is... well, I think we watched it together. Remember Kentucky Fried Movie?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the scene with the movie being shown in Feel Around.
Yeah.
And the guy has a usher behind him moving his hair around and stuff. Yeah. This reminded me of that when he gets the perfume shot in his face. So, and for anybody who hasn't seen Kentucky Fried Movie, go ahead and watch Kentucky Fried Movie. Some of it is dated poorly, but so much of it is still brilliant. So,
Rex Raymond, dangerous seeker.
Or the
let's not dive into politics.
It's a great movie. Great movie.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Quick question. So the iPhone was developed in 2000, or was released in 2007.
Yeah, but what came out before the iPhone?
Yeah.
The iPod. When does the iPod come out?
Oh, good. Do you know it?
Not off the top of my head, but there's something even before the iPod.
Let's see.
The iMac.
And the thing was iMac. So the iPod was released October 23rd, 2001. iMac was really the name of the thing?
Yeah, the iMac was a line of Macintosh computers. And that's originally released in 1998. And that's where the whole little lowercase I thing really takes off. Somebody may have done it before them, but really the iMac was the one that makes it popular.
So, what the hell does I stand for? There, yes. Wikipedia.
So, what does the I stand for?
Instruct individual in internet, warm, and inspire.
Yeah, basically anything you want it to mean.
Yeah.
It creates this whole line of goods that have an I in front of it.
iRobot. Okay.
Yeah. That is also one interpretation. But yeah, so this whole I nonsense starts with that, with the iMac, and so the iSmell is just basically trying to piggyback on that.
You could almost see it as a parody.
In many, many ways, yes. That's true. You could see it as a parody. Or piggybacking.
All right. Yeah, I really wonder how and why and who and how stoned were they. And anyhow, moving on. Micropose halts development of M1 Tank Platoon 3.
We talked in January about how Microprose, a Hasbro Interactive label, was still developing a handful of simulation products. Well, Gunship, with an exclamation mark, the latest in the classic series, got mediocre reviews and suffered poor sales, leading to M1 Tank Platoon 3 being canceled. And, I mean, we talked about this in a previous episode, but essentially this is the end of classic Microprose. They just, there's no market for their product as it exists, and the quality of the product has suffered so much because the old talent is gone that they are just not able to put out anything that is really going to bring in the sales that Hasbro is expecting.
So you think with the rebirth of Micropose under David Laghetti, There'll be a reboot of the series.
That is an excellent question. I don't know if his purchase of the Microprose name also came along with the old game IP. I don't know what he purchased. If he only owns the Microprose name, but he doesn't own the catalog, then he can't do a new gunship, a new M1 tank platoon. He can release other simulation games in a similar vein, but he can't use those names. So that's going to be the question. I mean, can he do another F-19 stealth fighter? No idea. It just depends on which IP he purchased when he purchased the name Microprose. Lord knows I'd love to see another colonization, but yeah. What? Sorry.
So times will tell.
Time will tell, exactly. And it's very nice of you to actually do the homework to look up the guy's name again.
Oh, yeah. And I didn't just Google that. Okay.
Of course.
Talking about Googling stuff. A new internet computer company releases a new internet computer.
Oh, yes. New Internet Computer is a startup company co-founded by Oracle CEO and co-founder Larry Ellison. Now, the machine they released, the New Internet Computer, all caps, or capital letter N, I, and C, is a Linux box with a CD-ROM drive, no hard drive, and just 4 megs of flash ROM. The low asking price of $199 was apparently not low enough for people to jump on board, though as they missed their first-year sales target of 5 million units by only selling 50,000. So, never heard of the New Internet Computer?
Not really.
Yeah. Exactly. I had a vague recollection of it, and it was one of many attempts to create these internet access terminal type devices at the time. So
wait, 5 to when's the was it a iBook?
The iBook, that was the laptop version of the Mac.
Okay, I don't want the laptop version. I want this iPad. Oh, Jesus, this crap. Sorry, Apple folks. Sorry.
Yeah. So the idea here was that, like we said, adults were engaging with the web. And this was the whole reason to buy a home computer now, was to be able to access the web. Well, why does an adult who's only accessing the web need, a 3D accelerator card and need all this other expensive hardware if let's just reduce it down to what you need for the web? The problem is that they're limiting themselves with this machine to a version of the web that probably was already about 5 years out of date. Because if you only got 4 megs of flash ROM, you're going to have to continuously reload web pages you were at before, because the images that from, let's say you jump through 5 different pages, if you want to go back to page 1, it's probably not in memory anymore because you already uploaded the 4 megs with GIFs or JPEGs or whatever. And now when you go back, you're going to have to reload it on a very slow connection. So this is just too spec down for functionality.
Oh, yeah.
And there's no future upward mobility with it. There's no way to move forward with this device. And the web at this point is developing so fast. I mean, it's literally at the point where at least once every couple of weeks, you're going to have to download an update to Shockwave, update to Flash, update to any and all of these plugins that allowed you to use multimedia on there, or an update to the browser because they were supporting some new way of processing image files. It was just a constant update, and you never really knew in which direction the technology was going to develop.
No wonder they did miss their sales target.
Yeah, they just by a little bit. 5 million was a very, very lofty goal. But it also kind of shows that Larry Ellison, while very, very smart in regards to the server side economics, moving from server side to retail, commercial retail, just those are two different worlds, and I don't really think he was thinking in that it was as different from what he was used to as it was. But oh well. It's nice of him to have tried, and when you think about people surfing on tablets and stuff nowadays, there is a little bit of that legacy that has permeated through.
All right, moving on. Logitech launches personal broadcasting software.
Oh yes, Logitech, a leading maker of digital camera and audio equipment for PCs, has begun to bundle their new personal broadcasting software with their devices. This software will make it easier for people to set up live cams on the machines. They are also including links to spotlife.com, a website that hosts live and pre-recorded webcam channels. Spotlife.com was partially funded by Logitech and would be acquired by them in 2002. So, speaking of how the web is evolving, basically this, in a way, is kind of a forerunner to vlogs. It is vlogs. So,
what?
A vlog. It's a video blog.
A vlog.
Yeah. So the idea here is that Logitech sells you the equipment to make your own vlog, but it also immediately gives you the website platform to post your video blogs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Spotlife has a similar problem to many other early attempts at video hosting, in that it's trying to be video and audio hosting. It's trying to be format specific. And the brilliance of YouTube is they just don't care what kind of content it is. And by being anything, you open yourself up to far more content, far more viewers, and the occasional copyright violation.
Well, but up to now, the owner of the platform wasn't responsible for it. So, at least in Europe.
Well, at least in Europe. But at the same time, you're still subject to takedown orders.
Sure.
So, and those takedown orders can really, really cost you money, because you have to have people judging it and assessing the problems and all this stuff. So those can be very, very expensive to handle.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah.
Micromania magazine has a guide to online abbreviations and emoticons. Cool.
Yeah. Stuff. In a sign of the times and continuing online gaming penetration in Europe, Spanish magazine Micromania has a 2-page article about online speak.
How to talk to the pros, man.
Exactly. Well, and I thought that this was really, really cool, because the magazine at this point for the last few months has been running a lot of articles on MMOs and the like, because the internet connections in Spain are slowly starting to get better. More and more people are able to access this stuff, and it's an interesting history with this magazine, because this is the magazine I grew up reading as a kid in the late 80s and early 90s. And so I actually remember how in 1990, actually in July or August of 1990, they have this big article introducing their readers to the concept of computer RPGs. And the reason they have to do this is that in Spain, there hadn't been any computer RPGs yet.
Okay.
Because the Spanish market was relatively small. If you're going to translate an RPG into Spanish, that's expensive. I mean, going in and rewriting all of that text cost you a fortune. And piracy was rampant. Nobody was going to invest that money. So, and developing an RPG takes a lot of time, and their primary system was the ZX Spectrum on cassette, which also meant that if you didn't load the entire game into the 48K of memory right from the get-go and you had to keep going back to the cassette, you were going to drive yourself insane. So you needed to develop games that would fit in the 48K or would have very limited reloading. Like, okay, I finished this stage, now I can load the next stage, but RPGs don't really work like that. You know, you're supposed to have a free-roaming world and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really work unless you have disk access. So they actually had these articles explaining to the reader what an RPG game is, because the very first ones, not translated, but the very first Ultimas and stuff to make it to Spain were getting Spanish distribution. Yeah. And they had to basically prepare people for this new genre. And they're doing something very similar 10 years later with, hey, here's these online games. Here is this online culture that in the US has already been going on for 5 years. Now we're finally joining it. Here's how to interact with them. And it's a really cool, I don't want to call it a public service, but it's a very, very cool thing just to see, okay, these guys are coming into it after the fact, and the magazine is trying to help them because the magazine is saying, guys, these games are really cool. They're really awesome, but it can also be overwhelming. Here's what's going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Funny.
Yeah, exactly. And it's cool. It's got like a whole glossary of terms, and this is what this means, this is what this means. And if you see this emoticon, it means this, and this emoticon means that. And yeah. Link in the show notes if you guys want to take a look at it. And last but not least.
Actually, so today, Infogrames kills GT Interactive.
Back in March of 1999, GT Interactive was gobbling up companies. In September, it was up for sale, and now 10 months later, it is no more. Infogrames has announced that they will no longer be releasing any games under the GT Interactive label, with all titles carrying the Infogrames name going forward. They also announced that they have hit a new record with more than $118 million in revenue in the third quarter. Infogrames CEO Bruno Bonnell hopes to be in the $1 billion annual revenue club with Electronic Arts within a year. Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, that didn't really work.
No, it doesn't work out for them. But they definitely had big dreams. And GT Interactive, well, its dreams are over.
Oh,
but
what else is over?
The podcast is over. Okay. So yes, we have successfully finished a podcast with the death of a company again.
Yeah, I love it.
It's been a while. It's been a few episodes since we've been able to do that. So.
Really? Honestly, I can't remember.
Yeah, I think it's been at least 2 episodes since we've done that. We've had deaths of companies, but they weren't in the 2000s. So, yeah. Okay, so what do you think of our wonderful trip today? Did you learn anything?
Did I learn anything? Yes, of course.
What did you learn?
Things such as an eye. Eye smell exists, so it's pretty awesome.
That's true. I wonder if you can still get the 128 chemical cartridges for it anymore.
Jesus. Hey, here's some cans on the box. Have fun. Yeah, in the end, and I really loved the 9-year-old guy Sue's Nintendo story, so that was pretty awesome.
Cool. Yeah. It's kind of a little bit of a slow month because it's the summertime, but at the same time, everybody's gearing up for Christmas, and the people who failed last Christmas are getting gobbled up or wiped out. So it's the cleanup period in summer before we get all the big cool releases in the fall and winter.
Yeah.
But okay. I think that concludes this episode. Remember, everybody, if you're still listening to us, the secret word of the day is eraser. I have no idea why I say that, but, somebody will tweet it, hopefully, and then I'll feel vindicated that somebody actually made it this far into the podcast. And... remember,
when the people are so far into our podcast, I think they'll be more than willing to. And I know asking for money is a bad thing to do, but guys, I'm an economist. I don't know any. How do you say any? I don't have dignity.
yeah, that's true.
So yeah, just one
and
word.
I'm a lawyer, so scruples, dignity. All that stuff is also history, so it's all good.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Patreon is the place to be. Remember, if we get enough money, you'll get us in surround sound. This is my personal goal.
Yeah. Remember, contributions start at just $1 a month, and we do post our interviews up there early. And so you'll be able to get some interview goodness over on Patreon before anybody else gets it. And you can also contact us on the Twitter. You can contact us on the Instagram. And if you can drop us an email anytime. We love to hear from you. And that's pretty much it for this show. So. Peter, say goodbye to the nice people.
Goodbye to the nice people.
Very good. And remember, have fun.